Territory and Tradition, Local Louisiana Gangs vs. National Gangs in Angola Prison. Tucked deep in the bayous of Louisiana, surrounded by swampland and farmland, sits one of the most feared prisons in America, the Louisiana State Penitentiary, better known as Angola. It is a place of history, punishment, and raw survival. But in the shadows of its long concrete walls, an often overlooked war has raged, a struggle for control between local Louisiana street gangs and the powerful national organizations that dominate prisons across the country. This is the story of a turf war behind bars, homegrown Louisiana loyalty versus the structured power of gangs like the Black Guerrilla Family, Gangster Disciples, Bloods, and Crips. Before the national gangs took root in Angola, Louisiana's prisons were largely influenced by local cliques, regional crews born on the streets of New Orleans, Baton Rouge, Shreveport, and Lafayette. These groups didn't follow the same rules as the major national sets. They were based on family ties, neighborhoods, and cultural loyalty, not prison-wide constitutions. Names like the Fisher Projects Crew, 12th Ward Hustlers, Bottom Boys, and Scotlandville Clique ruled with their own codes. In the 1980s and early 90s, these Louisiana gangs controlled the inside, from cell block politics to contraband smuggling. But as the U.S. prison population exploded, Angola began receiving transfers from across the country. Along with those transfers came something new: structure, hierarchy, and violence, unlike anything seen before. It began with the Bloods and Crips in the late 1990s. Then came the Gangster Disciples with their military-like chain of command and coded communication. And finally, the Black Guerrilla Family, bringing a political edge and deep ideological roots. These national gangs had one goal: expand and dominate. They didn't respect local traditions. They saw Angola as another chessboard, another stronghold to conquer. And for the local crews, that was a direct threat. What followed was a decade-long struggle for power. A war of attrition that played out cell by cell, yard by yard. In 2002, a local Baton Rouge crew got into a deadly altercation with members of the Gangster Disciples in Camp C. The fight left 2 inmates hospitalized and 1 in critical condition. The GDs responded with a coordinated stabbing days later, striking during chow time, using sharpened steel rods smuggled from maintenance work. Another flashpoint came in 2007 when the Crips attempted to recruit inside Angola's younger population. A well-known local leader from the New Orleans-based Calliope Posse refused to join. Weeks later, he was found with multiple stab wounds, barely clinging to life. The message was clear: join or fall. But the local Louisiana gangs didn't just roll over. What they lacked in numbers and national coordination, they made up for in intimate knowledge of Angola, its layout, its guards, its blind spots. They forged alliances across city lines, something rare on the streets. New Orleans cliques partnered with Shreveport sets. Baton Rouge linked with Lafayette. Together, they formed a loose coalition called the Home Team, united not by colors, but by regional identity. Their motto? "This is our house. Outsiders don't run Angola." They launched counterattacks, blocked recruitment drives, and used extortion and intimidation to maintain control in older units like Camps A and B. For a time, the national gangs were kept in check. But the tide began to turn in the 2010s. With national gangs offering protection, better commissary access, and stronger support networks, younger inmates, many without deep ties to their cities, started choosing affiliation with the Bloods, Crips, and GDs. The Black Guerrilla Family also gained influence among politically conscious inmates, drawing those disillusioned with the chaotic and tribal nature of local crews. Soon, the Home Team found itself outnumbered. Some of its top enforcers were transferred, isolated, or taken out in hits. National gangs expanded their reach into Angola's drug trade, dominating cell phone smuggling and extorting weaker inmates. The balance of power shifted, but the war never truly ended. Today, Angola operates under a tense coexistence. The national gangs control much of the contraband economy and dominate recruitment, especially among lifers and long-timers. But pockets of local resistance remain. Older dorms, kitchen crews, and agricultural details where local loyalty still runs deep. Every few months, a fight breaks out. A dorm goes on lockdown. A shank is found in a cell. These aren't isolated incidents. They're aftershocks of a war still smoldering under the surface. The conflict between local Louisiana gangs and national prison syndicates inside Angola is more than a turf war. It's a battle of identity between those trying to preserve their hometown loyalty and those building empires across state lines. The Shank War of 1999. Blood on the walls of Angola. In 1999, a series of bloody attacks would push the prison to the brink, a brutal chain of revenge, betrayal, and chaos. This was the Shank War of 1999. It started like many prison wars do, with power, territory, and an unresolved grievance. In Angola, gangs controlled the flow of contraband, access to drugs, phones, and even inmate protection. Among these groups were the Bloods, Crips, Black Guerrilla Family, Aryan Brotherhood, and a rising Latino presence. But 1999 marked a tipping point. Tensions simmered between two factions within the Bloods, one loyal to old-school leaders, the other to younger, more aggressive shot-callers who wanted to expand their influence beyond the dormitories. In April of that year, a high-ranking OG, known for brokering peace between gangs, was found stabbed in the upper chest with a handmade steel shank in the showers of Camp D. The attack was quick, efficient, and symbolic. His body was left on the floor, a warning to those who clung to the past. 3 inmates believed to be involved in the stabbing were cornered near the recreation yard. Inmates had sharpened toothbrushes, steel rods, and melted razors into deadly weapons. The fight lasted less than 2 minutes, but when it was over, 2 men lay bleeding. One would never leave Angola alive. This was the opening salvo of what would become known as the Shank War, a series of violent retaliations that would rage through Angola's cell blocks, showers, mess halls, and dormitories for the rest of the year. Unlike traditional gang wars, the Shank War of 1999 wasn't about 2 groups. It was about a fractured system. The lines of loyalty were blurry. Old allies turned on each other. Prison politics shifted daily, and fear swept across Angola like wildfire. Shanks, or improvised stabbing weapons, became the currency of survival. Inmates hid them in mattresses, inside toilets, in books, even melted into the soles of shoes. Entire wings were turned into battlegrounds. One notorious incident occurred in Camp J, Angola's most restrictive housing unit. An inmate slashed a rival's throat during a cell transfer using a homemade blade hidden in his waistband. The victim collapsed in front of guards, gasping for air as blood pooled beneath him. By mid-1999, Angola was in full crisis mode. The administration responded with mass lockdowns, stripping inmates of personal property, suspending visitation rights, and shutting down yard time. Tactical teams roamed the halls. But these measures only deepened the resentment. Inmates continued attacking each other, and now even the guards were targets. One corrections officer was stabbed through the arm during a routine cell check. Another suffered a punctured lung when a sharpened piece of bed frame was thrust through a slot in a cell door. The line between inmate-on-inmate violence and rebellion against staff began to blur. Word spread of a dead list, a handwritten roster circulating among inmates, naming targets marked for death. Some names were gang rivals, others were snitches, a few were guards. The list sparked paranoia. Inmates demanded transfers. Guards doubled their armor. An anonymous kite found in the chapel read, "If they're not with us, they're against us. Blood in, blood out." This wasn't just about retaliation anymore. It was about power, raw, primal power in a place built to crush it. The turning point came in October, when Angola's warden launched a calculated crackdown. Dozens of suspected leaders were extracted in midnight raids, shackled, and sent to closed-cell restriction, Angola's version of a dungeon. The prison brought in outside investigators. Cells were stripped bare. Over 150 weapons were confiscated in a single week. The violence slowed, not because peace was achieved, but because the warriors had been buried in concrete and steel. The war had burned itself out. But Angola would never be the same. The Shank War of 1999 left scars that Angola still carries. Dozens of inmates were injured. At least 6 were killed. Guards were hospitalized. Entire wings were permanently reshuffled. But beyond the bloodshed, the war revealed something deeper: the fragility of control inside America's toughest prisons. It showed how quickly discipline can give way to chaos, how inmate politics, if ignored, can spiral into civil war. For many in Angola, the Shank War wasn't history, it was a survival story. In a prison built on the bones of slavery, where cotton still grows and men still break rock under the southern sun, 1999 was a year of reckoning. A year when steel met skin and silence was shattered by screams. The Shank War of Angola wasn't about gangs. It was about power, survival, and the raw, unfiltered violence that brews behind locked doors. And in Angola, once the blood flows, it never really stops. Revolution Behind Bars: The Black Guerrilla Family vs. Angola. Prison guards. During the turbulent 1970s and 1980s, a new kind of resistance emerged from behind its bars. A revolutionary movement that challenged not just gangs or inmates, but the system itself. This was the rise of the Black Guerrilla Family, and their political war against the Angola prison guards would shake the very foundation of the American prison system. The Black Guerrilla Family, or BGF, was not just another gang. Founded in 1966 in California's San Quentin prison by Black Panther member George Jackson, the BGF stood for Black Liberation, Marxist-Leninist ideals, and the total dismantling of what they called the prison industrial slave system. When BGF members and sympathizers were transferred to Angola, they brought with them a dangerous weapon: revolutionary ideology. At Angola, where most inmates were black and the vast majority of staff were white, the idea of organized political resistance was seen as an existential threat. The guards didn't just see the BGF as troublemakers, they saw them as domestic enemies. At the center of this conflict stood 3 men: Herman Wallace, Albert Woodfox, and Robert King, later known as the Angola Three. All 3 were black inmates suspected of being BGF members or sympathizers. They weren't just inmates, they were political agitators, organizers, and advocates for prisoner rights inside one of America's harshest prisons. They fought for better conditions, protested racial segregation, and exposed guard brutality. But in 1972, their lives and the fate of the BGF inside Angola changed forever. A young white prison guard, Brent Miller, was stabbed to death in one of the cell blocks. The murder was brutal, sudden, and politically charged. Wallace and Woodfox were immediately blamed, despite a lack of physical evidence. They were convicted and placed in solitary confinement, where they would spend decades, not for what they did, but for what they believed. The response from the prison administration was swift and merciless. Alleged BGF members were thrown into closed cell restriction, Angola's version of solitary, for years at a time. Guards raided cells, burned literature, and targeted any sign of political unity among inmates. Angola transformed into a prison of political fear. The BGF's newsletters and study groups were labeled gang activity. Books were confiscated. Inmates who showed signs of organizing, even those not officially part of BGF, were punished. What Angola faced wasn't a traditional gang war. It was a war of ideology, and the system fought back with brute force. Inside the windowless concrete boxes where Wallace and Woodfox were held, they continued to resist. They wrote letters, organized hunger strikes, and exposed inhumane conditions through outside activists and journalists. Robert King, the third member of the Angola Three, would eventually be released after 29 years in solitary and became a voice for the voiceless. Meanwhile, guards and officials justified their actions by claiming the BGF represented a security threat, a radical movement bent on dismantling authority inside Angola. But as time passed, questions emerged. Was the BGF truly violent, or were they victims of a system that feared organized black resistance? The case of the Angola Three drew international attention. Human rights organizations called their treatment torture. Activists compared Angola to a modern-day plantation where political prisoners were punished for daring to speak out. In 2013, after 41 years in solitary confinement, Herman Wallace was released due to terminal cancer. He died days later, a free man for the first time in decades. Albert Woodfox followed in 2016 after his conviction was overturned multiple times and the state finally dropped all charges. Together, Wallace, Woodfox, and King had spent over 100 years in solitary confinement, all tied to the BGF and their alleged role in a system-wide political uprising. The battle between the black guerrilla family and Angola's prison guards wasn't just about control. It was about ideology, race, and power. The BGF saw themselves as freedom fighters, imprisoned not just for crimes, but for their resistance to injustice. The guards, steeped in a tradition of Southern authority and law enforcement, saw them as a direct threat to order and discipline. That war left scars on the prison, on the people, and on the national conversation about justice. Today, Angola still operates. The cells are still there. The walls still hold secrets. And the story of the black guerrilla family versus the Angola prison guards remains a chilling reminder that in the darkest corners of America's prison system, the line between criminal and revolutionary can be blurred by power, fear, and history. This was more than a gang war. It was a rebellion behind bars. Steel and shadows. The Mexican Mafia versus black gangs in Angola prison. In the early 2010s, Angola became the unlikely backdrop of a violent and underreported power struggle. A gang war that brought the Mexican Mafia, or La M, into a head-on collision with the black guerrilla family and street affiliates like the Bloods. For decades, Angola had been dominated by black inmates. With a majority black population and local control over drugs, phones, and illicit operations, the black guerrilla family and allied groups like the Bloods had carved out territories inside the aging prison blocks. The power structure was established, violent but predictable. Then, in the shadows of the drug pipeline moving through the U.S. South, La M began to make its move. Smuggling routes through Texas and Louisiana brought meth, heroin, and fentanyl into Angola, and with them came emissaries of the Mexican Mafia. They weren't loud, but they were organized, strategic, ruthless, and backed by powerful alliances with other Latino gangs and even elements of the Aryan Brotherhood. The first sign of trouble was subtle, a shift in the supply chain. Black gangs that had long controlled narcotics distribution within Angola began losing access. Their traditional routes dried up. Suddenly, the price of heroin surged while meth flooded the yards. La M was flexing its economic power, but the Bloods and BGF weren't about to be pushed aside. Tensions erupted in 2013 when a high-ranking Blood shot caller was stabbed in the showers of Camp C. The attacker, a known associate of La M, had used a homemade shank laced with battery acid. It was a message and a declaration of war. Within 48 hours, 2 Latino inmates linked to La M were ambushed near the dining hall. They were stabbed multiple times in the chest and neck. One survived. The other bled out on the floor, while alarms echoed through the block. From there, Angola was thrust into a low-intensity, high-danger gang war. The violence didn't come in full-blown riots. It came in calculated hits, weaponized locks, and ambushes in the showers. Guards began finding cryptic notes, kites warning of scheduled attacks, and lists of enemies. Prisoners were pulled into factions whether they wanted to be or not. This wasn't just about drugs or territory. It was about power, race, and identity. La M, a Mexican-American syndicate born in California's brutal prison system, brought its militant structure and hierarchy into Angola, a prison where race was already a source of constant pressure. Meanwhile, the BGF carried its own ideological fire. Rooted in black revolutionary politics, it wasn't just a gang, it was a movement. But its members, worn down by solitary confinement and decades of attrition, struggled to match La M's growing influence. That's when the Bloods stepped in. Unlike the older, more politically minded BGF, the Bloods operated like a street army, young, brash, and fiercely loyal. With their help, the BGF regained momentum, but at a cost. The war grew more violent. The administration at Angola attempted to quell the violence. Entire dorms were placed on lockdown. Known gang leaders were moved to closed cell restriction, or CCR. But these moves had little effect. La M's strength wasn't in numbers, it was in its network. Orders came from outside. Drug shipments moved through corrupt guards. Even in solitary, their leaders communicated through coded messages. The Bloods, in response, created strike squads, tasked with tracking La M affiliates and enforcing loyalty in the yard. The yard became a chessboard of movement and observation. One wrong glance could spark a stabbing. By 2015, Angola was on edge. Over 24 inmates had been injured or killed in gang-related attacks. Several were sent to outside hospitals, shackled to beds under heavy guard. The media barely noticed. Angola was used to violence. But inside, the war left its mark. New rules were drawn. La M secured a foothold in Angola's drug trade, especially methamphetamine. The Bloods retained dominance over phones and gambling. The BGF, battered but respected, continued its ideological resistance. It wasn't peace, but it was balance, for now. The Mexican Mafia's expansion into Angola prison was a calculated invasion, a power play in a place already steeped in blood and steel. Against entrenched black gangs like the BGF and the Bloods, La M proved that violence, money, and discipline could carve out a kingdom, even in a prison designed to break men. Angola remains a battleground where past rivalries still whisper through cell bars, and where the next war may only be one shipment or one stabbing away.